Hello and welcome to an episode of Historically Marked. I am in historic Lecompton, Kansas. It's a small town, but has a lot of history. In fact, it advertises itself as where the Civil War started and where slavery began to die. And I'm going to be going to some related places, including Constitutional Hall, plus a couple others. So come with me and read all about it. So I'm going to start out with this marker right here, which is the first thing you see as you come into town. In 1855, the new town of Lecompton became the capital of Kansas Territory. President James Buchanan appointed a governor and officials to establish government offices in Lecompton, and construction began on an elegant Capitol building. In the fall of 1857, a convention met in Constitutional Hall, which we'll be visiting, and drafted the famous Lecompton Constitution, which would have adopted Kansas as a slave state. The Constitution was rejected after intense national debate and was one of the prime topics of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The controversy contributed to the growing dispute soon to erupt in civil war. The Lecompton Constitution failed, in part because the anti-slavery party won control of the territorial legislature in the election of 1857. The new legislature met in Constitutional Hall, now a National Historic Landmark, and immediately began to abolish the pro-slavery laws. The victorious Free State leaders chose Topeka as capital when Kansas became a state in 1861. Constitution Hall still stands in Lecompton and is a state historic site. Part of the never-completed Capitol later was part of Lane University. President Dwight Eisenhower's parents met while attending Lane University here and were married in Lecompton in 1885. Interesting stuff. All right, we're going to go on down to Constitution Hall. So now we're at Constitution Hall. This is the oldest wooden building, and it's actually made of cottonwood. Well, it's the oldest wooden building in the state of Kansas. It is not the oldest building in Kansas. But here's a little background on Constitution Hall. During the year 1857, this building was one of the busiest and most important in Kansas Territory. Hundreds of settlers and speculators filed claims in the U.S. Land Office on the first floor. They sometimes fought hand-to-hand for their share of the rich lands that were opening for settlement. The government was beginning to remove the Indians from Kansas to make their lands available to whites. Upstairs, the district court periodically met to try and to enforce the territorial laws. Most free state people refused to obey these laws because they had been passed by the pro-slavery territorial legislature. This resistance made law enforcement nearly impossible for territorial officials. I'm going to skip some lines here and whittle some out, but the Lecompton Constitutional Convention met in the fall of 1857 in the second floor assembly room, which we're going to go in. The convention's purpose was to draft a constitution to gain statehood for Kansas. Newspaper correspondents from across the country gathered to report on the meetings. Many Americans feared a national civil war if the convention could not satisfy both pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Compromise proved impossible because pro-slavery men dominated the convention. They created a document that protected slavery no matter how the people of Kansas Territory voted. Anti-slavery opponents refused to participate in what they considered to be an illegal government. And then eventually the Lecompton Constitution was defeated at the national level. And here are some important events and usage of Constitutional Hall. And that's of course what it looked like back in 1877. So as you can see, it hasn't really changed very much. And as you can see, Lecompton Constitutional Hall has been designated a National Historic Landmark, and that was in 1975. And now I'm going to go in. It is open on select days. It is not open Monday or Tuesday, but you really got to check the hours. Just go to kansashistory.gov, and it's also closed on holidays. Alright, so I'm inside the building. And this is where Kansans, or people who migrate over here, this is where they, this is the land office where they could buy or sell land and whatnot. This here is the desk for the Lecompton Land Office, 1857. It's kind of depicted on what they may have looked like back in the day. And this is also where they made sure legal procedures were followed here. But there are lots of relics that are here and a lot of signage, so kind of very interesting stuff, like old photos. And how like this exhibit right here explains how photography was considered modern. It was definitely a relatively new invention that changed literally the face of everything. But yes, people came from all over Kansas territory to register their claims right here in this room. Now, before the Homestead Act was passed in 1862, usually land was purchased through preemption. A qualified person could claim up to 160 acres of government land with a payment of $1.25 per acre. But the claim must be improved with a residence and it must be occupied by the claimant. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it created the new Kansas Territory. And let me show you what Kansas looked like back in the day. Yeah, it looks really different than it does today because, yes, this is all Colorado, and Denver would have been, if this would have stayed today, then Denver would have been part of Kansas. Probably would have been the largest city. But the stage was now set for a drama that would end in civil war. The issue of slavery in Kansas was of great national concern. When admitted to the Union, Kansas would alter the balance of power between North and South. And then this here is Stephen Douglas, the U.S. Senator from Illinois who argued for states' rights. He wrote the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. He advocated popular sovereignty, by which voters would determine the fate of slavery in Kansas. And here's a little timeline of Kansas, 1855. And so that was when Kansas became a territory. Lecompton was designated as a territorial capital. Constitution Hall was constructed. And then the room I'm standing in, the land office, it operates from 1857 to March 1860. The pro-slavery Constitution. And by the way, this museum is free, but donations are greatly appreciated. So I'm going to go up to the second floor, and that was where the legislature met. Follow me. I'm sure you've heard the term Bleeding Kansas. And for those who forgot what it means, here it is. The armed conflict over the slavery issue earned the new territory the name Bleeding Kansas. Some observers estimate that as many as 200 people were killed for political reasons. The actual number was probably much less. Both sides overstated the number to promote their cause. And this talks about how frontiersmen who came here to Kansas, they mostly had weapons on them, like a Bowie knife and the revolver, the Colt revolver that is, and a rifle. And even back then, I mean, men wore them out in public like it was nothing because it was considered dress and it was used for protection, most likely among would-be assailants. And here in this room was where the men who were all pro-slavery met and arranged ideas for what Kansas would not become. And I'll go ahead and get into the details in just a second, and then they also drafted a constitution here. But did you also know that Lecompton, even though it was the official territorial capital of Kansas, there were also some unofficial ones, such as Pawnee. And then there was Topeka, where the anti-slavery people formed their own unofficial government and established Topeka as their capital. And as we all know, it is currently the capital of Kansas today. There is also Lawrence, which is about, I want to say about 5 to 10 miles east of here, and Mineola. But this was all because governmental functions were conducted at those places. And you can also like kind of highlight them. There you go. In September 1857, delegates to the Lecompton Constitutional Convention met in this room. All those men were pro-slavery because the anti-slavery people had refused to vote in the June 1857 election. John Calhoun was elected president of the convention. It was Calhoun's job to oversee the drafting of a constitution that would enable Kansas to become a state. The pro-slavery delegates also wanted this constitution to permit slavery within the new state. And about the Constitution, which is this, It was much like others from the western states. It set up 3 branches of government. It provided for the election of state officials. It only allowed male citizens to vote. This included no African Americans and few Native Americans. It declared the right to own slaves. By September 1857, most Kansans opposed slavery, and the delegates knew this. The members of the convention decided not to let Kansas vote fairly on the issue of slavery when they voted on the Constitution. As a result, most anti-slavery people refused to vote at all. Without their participation, the Constitution with the slavery clause was easily passed. It was sent on to President Buchanan and the United States Congress for consideration. This Constitution caused one of the most bitter political fights in American history. Northerners saw it as a pro-slavery fraud that was forced on the Free Staters. Southerners thought it was a fair document that had been accepted in a fair election. Both sides gathered all of their forces to win the battle in Congress. But that doesn't mean things were all fine and dandy within the Democrat Party because, yes, even the Democrat Party was split. Senator of Illinois Stephen Douglas, who was one of the strongest leaders of the Democrat Party, turned against the Democratic president James Buchanan. Douglas had drafted the Kansas-Nebraska Act that had allowed the people of Kansas to decide the slavery questions for themselves. Buchanan supported the Lecompton Constitution because he believed its adoption was the only way to keep the South in the Union. The battle between these 2 powerful Democrats split the party. And then this opened the way for this gentleman right here, Abraham Lincoln, to be elected president in 1860. And this was on the New York Times, so yes, even a place like that would reach out to New York. And then we get down to the final defeat. As a last solution to passage of the Constitution, the English bill was proposed. It would allow the people of Kansas to have a fair vote on the Constitution. August 2nd, 1858, the people of Kansas rejected the Lecompton Constitution by over a 5-to-1 margin. The defeat of this Constitution and the loss of Kansas as a slave state were 2 important causes of the coming Civil War. And here's something about John Calhoun, who was president of the 1857 Lecompton Constitutional Convention. And this goes on to talk about Lawrence, which was the scene of the most brutal event of the Civil War. A lot of details about that. Now, next to the Lecompton Hall is the Old City Jail. And there's a little something about Sheriff Samuel J. Jones, who, it says he constructed the Constitutional Hall, and he was also appointed Sheriff of Douglas County, Kansas, by Territorial Governor Daniel Woodson. He enforced the laws of Kansas territorial legislature, which caused much hardship and anguish on Free State settlers. He was shot in the back in Lawrence by Free State/abolition forces, and as a result of this action, he retaliated by sacking many buildings in Lawrence in 1856. And then he died in 1885 and was buried in Las Cruces, New Mexico. In 1935, his body was moved to the Masonic Cemetery and a new tombstone was installed. The original tombstone was left in the abandoned cemetery. And then it was brought here, and here it is. Interesting. I want to take a look at that jail real quick. And I wonder if we can actually go in. Let me see. Oh, yeah, we can. Well, I'm in jail once again. Not for anything I did wrong, but it is kind of creepy. It looks like they have they have a mannequin underneath the covers with their eyes open. Good Lord, here is a window. Oh, and it's open too. Let the breeze in. This will definitely be a room where you're wondering, man, what did I do to get in here? Oh yeah. But you also had a heating place too, so. And corn, and pretty much a place to sit besides your bed. But yeah. And now here is the Democratic headquarters on the other edge of town. The stone building was the headquarters of the Democratic Party during the Kansas territorial period. The cabin was used during a time when Lecompton, known as the birthplace of Kansas Democrat Party, was the territorial capital and stood at the center of national attention. Within these walls, ambitious and influential men gathered to discuss issues, plot strategies, and make decisions that helped to shape the destiny of Kansas politics and government. This was built in the 1850s by Italian stonemason Mark Maglario. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that right. but the structure was attached to a log cabin that has since disappeared. It may have been the residence of William Simmons and his son Thomas. In 1853, the Simmons traveled from Indiana to this place where they squatted a year before Kansas Territory legally was open for settlement. They made their living on the Kaw River, where they fished and operated the Ferry Queen, a 20-foot ferry made from hollowed-out sycamore logs. And then it was acquired by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, which for many years used the building as a pay station. And then in 1997, Pat and Aloria Istis purchased the property and began a reclamation of the building and grounds. In 1998, the site was acquired by the Lecompton Historical Society. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and get up closer to this building. It looks like it's open, but I don't think it is. Yeah, it's locked. But I can look inside the windows. Oh yes, everything looks really old-fashioned in there. And this here was at one time Lane University, and like the markers said, that's where Dwight David Eisenhower's parents met. Hopefully we all know who Eisenhower was, but yes, the President of the United States, the 34th one. But this originally was supposed to be the Kansas Territorial Capitol building when it was constructed in 1882, but the project was never completed. But the university operated in this building until 1902, when it was merged with another school. The building was later restored by the Lecompton Historical Society and reopened as the Territorial Capitol Museum in 1982, where it still operates today, and it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I decided not to stop in today, but it would be a really cool place to visit. The museum is open.